Tears of the Kingdom completely changed the Zelda timeline. Leading up to the release of the game, fans of the series like myself theorized where exactly Tears of the Kingdom would fit within the Zelda timeline. Nintendo is so ambiguous about the game, and they made sure to show off footage that didn't really reveal too much that hinted to the timeline placement. Some footage looked futuristic, while other footage looked archaic. There was really no telling when exactly the game fit into the timeline. Now that Tears of the Kingdom is finally released, and now that I've beaten all of the main story as well as a lot of the additional content, I still really have no idea where exactly in the timeline the game takes place. And that brings me to the topic of this video. Let's try to figure out when and where Tears of the Kingdom fits within the Zelda timeline. And really quick, before we get into the nitty-gritty, I just wanted to express a quick thanks to all of you. My addiction to the Legend of Zelda video really blew up, and it got way more support than I anticipated. Thank you to every single one of you who checked out the video, liked, commented, or shared it. I've really enjoyed interacting with each and every one of you in the comments and getting your unique perspectives on the series as a whole. If you're new to the channel and you haven't seen that video, you should definitely check it out. I share my own experience playing through the series as well as the impact it's had on my friendships, relationships, and just life in general. I'll include a link in the description below, and I'll also try to include a quick little box on the screen that'll take you directly to the video. No promises on that one though, since I'm still getting the hang of YouTube. Anyways, back to the main part of the video, the Zelda timeline and where Tears of the Kingdom falls within it. First things first, I need to quickly say that the Zelda timeline is complicated. You'd think that a series as popular as The Legend of Zelda would have a clear and concrete timeline, and that each new game release would be added somewhere within that timeline. Instead though, The Legend of Zelda has rarely had a complete timeline. Each new release seems to restructure the timeline and recontextualize the series as a whole. And after Breath of the Wild released, it was announced to be at the very end of the timeline. Prior to the release of Breath of the Wild, the Zelda timeline seemed to have finally set itself in stone. And after Breath of the Wild released and was announced to be at the very end of the timeline, fans like myself felt confident in what appeared to be the definitive Zelda timeline. However, 6 years later, Tears of the Kingdom released, and it threatened the livelihood of the current Zelda timeline. First things first, Tears of the Kingdom is actually a direct sequel to Breath of the Wild, meaning that from a timeline perspective, it takes place directly after Breath of the Wild. Seems simple enough, right? So what's confusing about all this? Well, even though Tears of the Kingdom takes place after Breath of the Wild, it also takes place before it. Using the power of the Zonai's Secret Stone, Zelda accidentally channels her powers as the Sage of Time to travel far back into the past. It's at this point in time that she meets Rauru and Sonia, the ancient first king and queen of Hyrule. After meeting Rauru and Sonia, a series of events take place that eventually lead to the iconic event known as the Imprisoning War, the great battle between the Seven Sages and Ganondorf. For anyone who's followed this series for a while or played any of the other games in the series, you've probably heard about the Imprisoning War and the creation of Hyrule. The Imprisoning War actually takes place before A Link to the Past, and the creation of Hyrule is mentioned in several games prior to Tears of the Kingdom. Learning more about these events in Tears of the Kingdom was really cool, but after a little bit of thought, I realized that things didn't quite add up from a timeline perspective. As it turns out, the information and historical content that Tears of the Kingdom introduced was very controversial. Some fans viewed these new series of events as plot holes within the story, while others viewed them as retcons to the entire timeline. I myself don't think either of these things. I think that Tears of the Kingdom does actually occur at a specific point in the timeline, and I plan to shed some light on that. In order to do that though, it's important to understand the structure of the Zelda timeline. So, how exactly does the Zelda timeline work? Well, the timeline starts with Skyward Sword, technically many years before the start of Skyward Sword, when the goddess Hylia fought against Demise and created the Sky Kingdom to protect Hylians and the Triforce from Demise's influence. After this, the events of Skyward Sword take place, the Master Sword is created, and the resurrected Demon King Demise is sealed away inside of it. Link, Zelda, and potentially Groose all remain on the surface land below Skyloft, and it's implied that they begin to found what eventually becomes the Kingdom of Hyrule. After this, an unknown number of years pass, the Kingdom of Hyrule has been founded, and the events of the Minish Cap and Four Swords take place. Years later, the events of Ocarina of Time take place, and this is where things first get a little crazy within the Zelda timeline. The Hero of Time's adventures and climactic battles against Ganondorf and Ganon actually take place across 2 different times. One in which Link is a young child, and one 7 years later in which Link has grown into an adult. 2 different timelines are created, which are known respectively as the Child Timeline and the Adult Timeline. The Child Timeline is set after the final battle against Ganondorf, when Link finally defeats Ganon and uses the Ocarina of Time to return 7 years back into the past to live out his youth. It's in this timeline that the events of Majora's Mask, Twilight Princess, and Four Sword Adventures take place. The adult timeline is set after the defeat of Ganondorf and Ganon. Link returns to the child timeline, and now there's no longer a Hero of Time in the adult timeline. In this timeline, the events of the Wind Waker, Phantom Hourglass, and Spirit Tracks take place. Now, this is where things get even more complicated. There's actually a third timeline which is created through Ocarina of Time, one in which the Hero of Time is actually defeated by Ganon. After Ganon's triumphant and devastating victory over the Hero of Time, the 7 sages manage to seal Ganon away in an event which becomes known as the Imprisoning War. After the Imprisoning War, the events of A Link to the Past, Link's Awakening, Oracle of Seasons, Oracle of Ages, A Link Between Worlds, Triforce Heroes, Zelda 1, and Zelda 2 take place. A lot happens in this particular timeline. So now we've established that the canonical Zelda timeline has split itself into 3 different timelines. From this point forward, any new Zelda releases can fall anywhere within 3 different timelines, or even during the time prior to Ocarina of Time and the timeline split. So where does Breath of the Wild fit into that timeline? Well, in what I believe is a brilliant move by the Zelda team, Breath of the Wild was set a significant and undisclosed number of years in the future after every single game in the series. At some point, after many years, all 3 of the split timelines converge back into one single timeline in which Breath of the Wild occurs. During Breath of the Wild, it's established that 10,000 years in the past, Calamity Ganon was defeated by an ancient hero, an ancient princess, 4 champions, their divine beasts, and Sheikah guardians. 10,000 years later, Zelda, the Princess of Hyrule, Link, her appointed knight, and the 4 new champions, Mipha, Daruk, Revali, and Urbosa, all prepared for the return of the Calamity. Unfortunately, they weren't as prepared as they thought, and Calamity Ganon wreaked havoc on Hyrule as they knew it. Link and the champions were defeated, and Zelda, having awakened her sealing powers, managed to just barely seal Calamity Ganon away while also suspending herself in a sealed state. 100 years pass, and Link wakes up in the Sheikah Shrine of Resurrection. Without his memories, Link then set out to reacquire his memories, rescue Zelda, and defeat Calamity Ganon. After succeeding in a climactic and cinematic victory against Calamity Ganon, Hyrule found itself in an era of peace. Link and Zelda set out together on a new adventure to restore the Kingdom of Hyrule and its civilization to its former glory. Several years passed and the Kingdom of Hyrule found itself in its rebuilding stages. Link and Zelda have now become well known throughout the Kingdom of Hyrule, and their efforts to rebuild the kingdom are proving very successful. It's at this point that gloom begins showing up throughout Hyrule. While investigating the source of the gloom, Link and Zelda come across the mummified Ganondorf, who breaks free and immediately begins wreaking havoc on Link, Zelda, and the rest of Hyrule in a new calamitous event known as the Great Upheaval. As I mentioned earlier, Zelda's transported back to the past using the power of the Zonai Secret Stone. Link wakes up on the Great Sky Island, and it's at this point that Link's adventures in Tears of the Kingdom officially begin. And with that, we've now reached the point that Tears of the Kingdom's timeline placement gets hazy. We know that Link's adventure and battle against Ganondorf all take place after Breath of the Wild, but now we have to figure out what point in time Zelda actually travels back to, and where exactly that fits within the timeline. Right now, I can think of 4 different points in the timeline that Zelda's portion of Tears of the Kingdom can take place. So let's get into proving why each of these points could or couldn't be where Tears of the Kingdom fits into the Zelda timeline. From the very beginning of Tears of the Kingdom, it's established that the Imprisoning War is a major plot point. When exploring underneath Hyrule Castle, Zelda and Link come across a series of murals or hieroglyphics. After observing them, Zelda quickly recognizes that they depict the Imprisoning War, aka the sealing of the Demon King. Zelda throwing out the title, The Imprisoning War, immediately set off sirens in my head, and I'm sure that other fans of the series had the same reaction. Within the first 5 minutes of the game, we now had what we thought was clear confirmation that Tears of the Kingdom was a part of the Fallen Hero timeline. In addition to that, it seemed like the Zelda team had actually retconned Breath of the Wild's placement, since it'd now have to be a part of the Fallen Hero timeline too. Zelda fans are no strangers to timeline retcons, and while I'd hoped it wouldn't happen, I think a retcon like this isn't majorly impactful to the current Zelda timeline. All the games except for Breath of the Wild would remain in their original spot, and both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom would have concrete placements within the timeline. So in addition to being set directly after Breath of the Wild from the very beginning stages of the game, it seemed like Tears of the Kingdom was also going to be set after Ocarina of Time in the Fallen Hero timeline, depicting the events of the Imprisoning War that eventually led into A Link to the Past. Now all's fine and dandy with this particular timeline in the beginning of the game, but as we start to learn more about the story, certain plot holes open up and create more contradictions to this particular timeline placement that can't really be ignored. Tears of the Kingdom's Imprisoning War is described as the events in which Rauru, the first king of Hyrule, seals Ganondorf away while aided by 6 other sages, including Zelda, who traveled from the past. Immediately I have more questions than answers. If Rauru is the first king of Hyrule, then we can't be talking about the same imprisoning war. Hyrule in Tears of the Kingdom was only just beginning and developing as a kingdom. Ocarina of Time's Hyrule was already well and established. These 2 points in time are clearly different. Also, the 7 sages in Ocarina of Time are completely different than those in Tears of the Kingdom. Since you don't know the names or faces of the Goron, Zora, or Gerudo sages, you could make the argument that they're the same, but that's super speculative. Tears of the Kingdom Zelda is also not the same Zelda as the one in Ocarina of Time. The same can't be said about Rauru. While Rauru is a sage in both Ocarina of Time and Tears of the Kingdom, you can't tell me that these 2 Rarus are the same person. Minoru and the Rito sage are also the 2 remaining sages in Tears of the Kingdom. In Ocarina of Time, the 2 remaining sages are Impa and Saria. Things just aren't adding up here. Also, the whole point of this video was to figure out where Tears of the Kingdom could fit into the current Zelda timeline. That means we're not doing retcons. The fact that the only way this timeline placement could possibly work is with a retcon timeline means that this timeline placement just doesn't work. With the timeline convergence, that would mean that the Imprisoning War, start of the Kingdom of Hyrule, and all the other events leading up to Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom would all have to occur in all 3 branches of the timeline. It just doesn't work. And so at this point, I think it's time to abandon any thoughts or hopes that Tears of the Kingdom's Imprisoning War is the same as the Imprisoning War between Ocarina of Time and A Link to the Past. It's time to accept that there are now multiple Imprisoning Wars in the Zelda timeline. And so with that, what's the next possible point in time that this new Imprisoning War and Tears of the Kingdom could take place? Well, the next possible point in time that I can think of is actually at the very beginning of the timeline, even before the start of Skyward Sword. If Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom are set at the very end of the timeline after the point of the timeline convergence, I think it's reasonable to consider that the past portion of Tears of the Kingdom might have been at the very beginning of the timeline before Skyward Sword even. During Skyward Sword, Link adventures through the surface and the skies, and both time travel and time manipulation are ever present in this game through the Gate of Time and the Time Stones respectively. While playing Skyward Sword, we get glimpses into what the past prior to Skyward Sword was like. Surprisingly, there's a lot of technology from an unknown ancient civilization that actually resembles Zonai technology, particularly the beetle and the whip. Some of the Zonai constructs also bear slight, and I mean very slight, resemblances to the ancient robots in Skyward Sword. Now these similarities don't really mean anything, they're very speculative, but they do offer some form of potential insight or clues to how Tears of the Kingdom might fit within the timeline. We've established and accepted that there are multiple imprisoning wars as well, so it's possible that Tears of the Kingdom's imprisoning war did take place in the times prior to Skyward Sword. The problem with this though is that there's a whole other event or 2 before Skyward Sword that could be considered as entirely different imprisoning wars that took place around the time that Tears of the Kingdom might fit within that timeline. The first of these 2 potential imprisoning wars would be the war that was described in the opening cutscene of Skyward Sword, when the goddess Hylia fought against the Demon King Demise, sealing him away at the sealed grounds. I think it's safe to call this event another imprisoning war, and why is that? Well, every time Hylia's seal comes loose, Demise emerges from the seal not as Demise, but as the Imprisoned. If you're gonna go and call something the Imprisoned, some sort of imprisoning event had to have taken place to imprison it, right? It's almost like the game is indirectly telling us that this was another imprisoning war. In addition to this potential imprisoning war, you might even call Link's climactic battle with Demise and his forces another imprisoning war, since he does seal away Demise within the Master Sword, imprisoning the Demon King within the blade that seals the darkness. I think this one's a little more of a stretch to call it an imprisoning war, but there's definitely some potential. So with both of these events in mind, I think it's a bit of a stretch to say that Tears of the Kingdom falls before Skyward Sword. For this to be the case, Tears of the Kingdom's imprisoning war would have to be in between the imprisoning war in which Hylia imprisoned Demise for the first time, and the imprisoning war in which Link sealed Demise in the Master Sword. There are a few different contradictions which you could use to prove this isn't the case, but the main thing that sticks out to me is that Ganondorf shouldn't exist yet. Based on the story across the entire series, Ganondorf is supposed to be a reincarnation of Demise. After Link seals Demise within the Master Sword, Demise curses Link and Zelda, establishing the line of reincarnated Links, Zeldas, and Ganondorfs, or really just Ganon. With this in mind, the Demon King Ganondorf really shouldn't exist until after Demise's curse is set at the end of Skyward Sword. Really, I feel like putting Tears of the Kingdom at this point in the timeline is really messy. You end up having to justify a lot more and get highly speculative. A couple more potential contradictions I thought of that I couldn't quite answer or excuse are as follows. What about the sages? We don't see the Zora, Rito, or Gerudo in Skyward Sword, so how could the Tears of the Kingdom sages even be present then? Rauru and Sonia are the first king and queen of Hyrule, but Hyrule doesn't even seem to exist yet. Is the ancient civilization we see in Skyward Sword Rauru and Sonia's Hyrule? If you've got any ideas or answers for these questions, let me know down in the comments. Ultimately, I'm sure every Zelda fan has their own idea or theory for where in the timeline Tears of the Kingdom could be, and I want to hear it. So now that we've established Tears of the Kingdom can't take place before Skyward Sword, let's move on to the next option. What about if Tears of the Kingdom took place after Skyward Sword? And when I say after Skyward Sword, I'm thinking particularly of the time between Skyward Sword and the Minish Cap. Now, out of all the timeline placements we've discussed so far, I think this one makes the most sense. After Link defeats Demise in Skyward Sword, Demise curses Link and Zelda to reincarnate along with himself in future generations. Link and Zelda return to the present and choose to stay on the surface. At the time of the game's release, it's kind of assumed that they establish Hyrule as we know it. The thing is, though, that actually isn't the case. Correct me if I'm wrong, but there's no actual proof or evidence that Link and Zelda establish Hyrule. In Skyward Sword, Zelda says she wants to stay on the surface to watch over the Triforce. The way I see it, Link and Zelda may have started what eventually becomes Hylian civilization on the surface, but by no means did they actually establish the Kingdom of Hyrule. Several events occur between Skyward Sword and the Minish Cap, and by the start of the Minish Cap, the Kingdom of Hyrule has been founded. If I remember correctly, prior to Tears of the Kingdom, there hadn't ever been any official story of how the Kingdom of Hyrule was founded. We know about Hyrule's creation and all the lore surrounding Din, Nehru, and Furore, but we never had any actual description for how the Kingdom of Hyrule was founded. In Tears of the Kingdom, though, we get to learn exactly how the Kingdom of Hyrule is founded. Based on Tears of the Kingdom of Hyrule is founded by Rauru, one of the last surviving members of the Zonai tribe, and Sonia, a priestess and the Sage of Time. In Tears of the Kingdom, it's stated that Rauru and Sonia are the first king and queen of Hyrule, and it can be inferred that the royal family of Hyrule descended from the two of them. As in Tears of the Kingdom, Sonia says that she can sense Zelda shares some blood connection with her and Rauru. It's also implied that Zelda is a descendant of Rauru and Sonia because she has the ability to use Rauru's ability as the Sage of Light and Sonia's abilities as the Sage of Time. So now we've established that Hyrule's founding as shown in Tears of the Kingdom might fall perfectly in the place between Skyward Sword and the Minish Cap. But there are still a couple possible plot holes or contradictions that we've got to discuss. Firstly, back to the Imprisoning War. In that time between Skyward Sword and the Minish Cap, the Imprisoning War between Rauru, Zelda, the Sages, and Ganondorf had to have taken place as well. In this Imprisoning War, Rauru seals Ganondorf for an unknown but very significant amount of years. After that, Zelda goes through the Dragonification ritual and flies through the skies above Hyrule as she works to restore the Master Sword for the Hero of Wild to use against Ganondorf when Rauru's seal is undone. Now, Ganondorf is sealed, and Zelda's an immortal dragon. Technically, neither of them have died. If Tears of the Kingdom really does take place between Skyward Sword and the Minish Cap, then that would mean that many reincarnations of Link, Zelda, and Ganondorf have to have existed between this imprisoning war and Tears of the Kingdom at the very end of the timeline. Is it possible that we could have reincarnations of Zelda and Ganondorf while technically they're both still alive? That would mean that there'd be multiple Zeldas and multiple Ganondorfs alive at the same time. Is that even allowed? Well, in the case of Zelda, we actually have hard proof that two Zeldas can exist at the same time. And this proof comes from the most unlikely of sources, Zelda 2. After Link rescues Zelda at the end of Zelda 1, Hyrule begins to rebuild. Some of the monsters in Ganon's army are still alive and hunting down Link. A mysterious triangle appears on Link's hand, and it's at this point that Impa reveals to Link that there's another Princess Zelda, an ancient princess who is placed under a spell of eternal sleep by a magician working closely with the Prince of Hyrule, whose mind had become demented by the desire for the complete Triforce. So now we have two different Zeldas in the same world, one being the Zelda that Link rescued at the end of Zelda 1, and the other being the ancient princess cursed with eternal slumber. This seems like cold hard proof that two Zeldas can certainly exist at the same time. And if we accept that multiple Zeldas can exist at once, technically that would even mean that 3 different Zeldas existed during Zelda 2, since that would mean the immortal light dragon Zelda would be flying through the skies above Hyrule as well. So since we've established that multiple Zeldas can exist at once, I think the same could be said about Ganondorf. I think it makes sense that so long as Ganondorf is sealed, another could reincarnate. I think that the eternal sleep we see from the ancient Princess Zelda could be thought of as a form of sealing, and that's what allowed future Zeldas to reincarnate. Likewise, I think that Raru's seal on Ganondorf and Zelda's Dragonification likely had the same sealing effect and allowed future Zeldas and Ganondorfs to reincarnate. I don't think we've ever seen an instance of this for Link, but I would think that the same rules would apply. That might even be something cool to see in the future. Oh, and a quick side note too is that this would also imply the existence of multiple Master Swords, since the Light Dragon Zelda would be carrying the broken Master Sword from Tears of the Kingdom while flying through the skies unseen in all the other games. I don't recall there ever being multiple Master Swords, but I think this can be justified right alongside the existence of multiple Zeldas, Links, and Ganondorfs. Let me know what you think about this portion of the theory because it's a bit more speculative if you ask me. So everything is seeming to add up with this particular timeline placement for Tears of the Kingdom. I personally like this placement a lot too, and I think that from an overall lore perspective it adds some really cool layers to the story. There is one final contradiction though, and that throws a bit of a wrench into this timeline placement, and that final contradiction is the ancient Zonai hero. After completing all the shrines in Tears of the Kingdom, Link is rewarded with the ancient hero's aspect, a set of armor that's said to contain the spirit of a hero who once saved Hyrule. This armor set actually completely changes Link's character model and makes him resemble a member of the Zonai tribe. Now, this armor in and of itself isn't what causes the contradiction though. Instead, what causes the contradiction is Impa's reaction when she sees Link wearing the armor. If Link visits Impa while wearing this armor, she'll recognize it as the ancient hero's attire. She'll then say that Link looks like the figure depicted on the ancient mural of the original Calamity in Breath of the Wild. It's heavily implied that this ancient hero was the hero from the Calamity, and that's a really cool piece of lore. Unfortunately though, that causes a bit of a riff in this potential timeline placement. Since the Zonai tribe was supposedly all but gone in Tears of the Kingdom, we'll call Rauru and Sonia's descendants the new Zonai tribe, and if Tears of the Kingdom really does fit in after Skyward Sword, why haven't we seen any of the new Zonai tribe throughout the other games in the timeline? Since Breath of the Wild takes place many years after the timelines are conjoined, that would imply that the first Calamity did too. So if the new Zonai tribe was founded after Skyward Sword, and if it still existed during the first Calamity, then again, why weren't the new Zonai tribe ever seen in any of the other games before these points in the timeline? You'd think that such an important tribe would have been present in at least one of Link's adventures during that time, and their absence really does make it difficult to justify this timeline placement works 100%. Realistically though, it just boils down to the Zelda team coming up with new ideas over time. If this timeline placement were to work, all you'd have to do is accept one of two things. Either the new Zonai tribe did exist and just weren't present in any of the other games, or what Impa said about Link looking like the figure in the mural isn't accurate at all. I mean, look at the mural. There's a lot left to the imagination. If this ancient hero looks like this, that would mean that the ancient Zelda in this timeline looked like maybe this? I think we can pretty confidently say that these two ancient heroes aren't necessarily the same. Ultimately, I think this placement in the timeline works. I think that until we get confirmation from Nintendo regarding where exactly in the timeline Tears of the Kingdom falls, that This is a great headcanon placement for the game. There is, however, one final place within the Zelda timeline that's honestly far more likely to be where Tears of the Kingdom falls. This timeline placement makes far too much sense, and it's honestly the easiest place that the Zelda team could put the timeline. That being the beginning of the conjoined timelines, essentially starting what we could call the new Zelda era that was ushered in by Breath of the Wild. This seems like such a cop-out, but really I think it builds on the idea that we're now in a new era of Zelda games, one with a much more concrete and uniform timeline. The events in one game directly affect the one set afterwards. No plot holes, contradictions, or timeline changes. I don't have any problems with this option either. I mean, sure, I did just write a 10-page script about the Zelda timeline and my own speculations about where Tears of the Kingdom falls within it, but I'd much rather know where it is within the timeline. Not every fan is going to want to conduct a thorough investigation in order to figure that out. If the Zelda team does go with this option, I honestly think it'll be much better for the series and all the games that come out in the future. So what do you think? Tell me whether or not you like this option in the comments below. Where do you think Tears of the Kingdom falls within the Zelda timeline? Do you think that any of the placements I talked about were accurate, or do you think I'm just full of bogus? I'd love to hear what you think. Ultimately, we don't know anything for sure yet. We'll just have to wait until Nintendo tells us. Until then though, we can keep theorizing and speculating amongst ourselves. So that's what I'll do, and I hope that's what you all will do in the comments too. Thanks a ton for listening to me ramble on about Zelda once again. I promise not to do that every time I post a video. I've got a few different videos in the works that aren't all Zelda related, but until I'm done with those, I hope you continue enjoying this video and all the other videos of me and my friends on the Torque Force YouTube channel. If you did enjoy this video, I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit the like button or even subscribed. It really does help the channel out. Thanks so much again for your support, and until next time, without further ado, goodbye.
Hear me scream, I'm here to break your stream. Hog-a-honkus, hear me scream, I'm here to break your stream.